Okay, hello everyone. We are very happy to be here today for another Metrics of Regulation webinar where we explore new measurements and new ways to measure and to understand regulation. Today we are very happy to have Dr. Eliška Drápalová with us, who will present a measure of regulatory stringency and apply it to understand how city governments have adjusted their regulations to counteract the growing influence of platform companies. Eliška is a postdoctoral fellow at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center and a comparative political scientist focusing on urban governance, regulation, and digitalization. She co-directs a DEF-GEF-funded project on regulating platform companies in European cities together with Professor Kai Wegrich, Professor of Public Administration and Public Policy at the Heritage School in Berlin, who is the co-author of this paper. And I think we'll start with the presentation and looking forward to hear you and afterwards we'll have a session of Q&A where everyone could ask questions and sharing feedback. So Eliška, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Nir and David for kind invitation and for introduction and for possibility to present our paper. So this paper, as Nir already said, is part of a DFG project that we are conducting but already finishing. So within 2 months the project is ending, and this paper is part of this project and has been recently published. So we are very proud of this. But as well, I added some results that we are now working on. So there is some kind of, if you already read the paper, happen to read the paper, then there is some new results as well. So something added. So I will do the share screen. So what we do in this paper is we want to look at how European cities have regulated platform companies in time, and we want to focus on the broader trends in large kind of N settings. So we have over 100 cities in 9 countries, data over decade, and we wanted to link it to concept of the regulatory entrepreneurs, platform power, and see how this kind of regulatory battleground between platforms, sectoral platform companies, and city regulators is actually evolving, and who is holding the upper hand. So why we are interested in platform power and regulation? So I think if you're here, you are interested or you're thinking about platforms. Platforms become very important actors shaping economies, markets, but as well social life, the way how we travel, maybe find friends. But it as well transform or challenge as a state. We talk about platform government, but platforms, what they did as well, affect a lot regulation. This is often portrayed by what we call policy entrepreneurship. So Pullman and Berry link that concept to platforms, as they are kind of having within their DNA or the business plan the need to change the regulation in order to thrive economically. So in a nutshell, regulation is central to platform business model, and for platform companies, they really need to change the regulation in order to amass the network effect and be important. And therefore, lot of researchers are looking at platforms and policy entrepreneurship, showing this kind of dominant narrative that platforms exploit, bypass, or reshape the regulation. In other hands, they have the upper hand on regulators, and especially on cities that basically only adapt to platforms. Oh, another very important argument is timing, right? So the platforms move fast, and then they ask for forgiveness. They bypass the laws, and if the local regulators are lose the timing, then it's very hard to control the platforms back. So there's this idea of platforms are trying to disrupt the regulations, stall the state, make it hard for regulation to return or to combat or regulate. However, the emerging empirical evidence showing that there is a lot of variation in the platform influence, and that the platform influence is context dependent and several times. So we see in many instances that platforms indeed regulate. They sometimes regulate with a big rigor, and they are successful in regulating or even pushing back platforms from the local markets, banning them or regulating them tightly. So it's kind of you have these two literatures or strands, one more theoretical, talking about platform power and sources of different sources of platform power, and then you have the more empirical case-based literature that showing that there is indeed more variation, and the platform power is much more context dependent. So we wanted to bridge these two literatures, and we think that there is an important gap to fill, and that's the limited comparative and longitudinal evidence. Yeah, so we wanted to see how the platform power and the regulation change over time and in much broader sample of cities. Most studies are actually or theoretical or focusing on single countries or sectors. And therefore, we lack the systematic understanding of how this interplay between platforms and local regulators is actually taking shape. So we're starting from the premise that the platform power is not uniform, invariable, or constant, but it's negotiated, adapted, contested in the local context. And for us, platforms are regulatory entrepreneurs, so they aim on changing the local regulation. Because, as I said, they aim for network effect, so this quick expansion, and they do that by generally exploiting the gray zones or disregarding the local regulation. Yeah, so therefore, if the local regulation is enforced or even increased, this can hamper this fast moving or the amassing the network effect for these platforms. So this is very important for them. Therefore, we look at the regulation as kind of the battlefront or area where the platforms really have a high stakes and show their power. So if the regulation is disregarded, if the regulation is lenient towards platforms or change in their favor, we assume that the platforms has more power. Wherever when cities or other regulators enforce more strict rules, more stringent rules, we see it as a increasing regulatory capacities of cities and limit and decreasing power of platforms. And we look at the cities for several reasons. We think that they are actually our forerunners. They are local regulators are those that generally quickly and much more harshly regulate cities. they are as well part of the platform sectoral platform business model. So platforms, they don't own their assets. They need the local streets and the local taxis or drivers to pick up the people, as they don't own the housing stock or the apartments they offer on their website. So for them, cities and the density and number of people living in the cities are important for their business. But as well in cities, a lot of externalities that these platforms are creating are concentrating in one place. So platforms create many users that benefit, but as well they create externalities like increasing housing prices, congestion, labor market dualization that are concentrated on local level, and therefore there are high stakes for local regulators. Therefore, we think that cities are actually a very good place to not only theoretically look but and empirically observe this phenomenon, but so we focus on local regulation, and we focus on platforms in two sectors. We focus on ride hailing, so transportation sector, and short-term rentals. And this is mostly because they have one dominant platform that is uniform across countries. So we can compare. This is a comparative angle in the reason in this. These platforms generally follow this very similar strategies across countries and cities. They erupted in Europe apparently more or less at the same time. And these sectors are sectors where local governments can regulate. So we don't look, for example, at labor regulation or other platforms, because cities generally don't have competencies in labor markets, etc. So we look at the housing and transportation sectors. And so how we do that? How we can map power that the platform have and how the regulation evolve? We need an instrument that can capture these different aspects and can trace it over time. So what we did, we created an index that we called the Regulatory Stringency Index, or Platform Regulatory Stringency Index. And we measure intensity of local regulation towards platforms in these two sectors. And we focus on we use Franken and Thelen, and we created measure, or we distinguish between measure regulatory focus and regulatory area. So we look at what regulators focus on when they regulate in five areas, which is competition, taxation, public goods, consumer protection, and security. Yeah, and within these we have a different items or different aspects that can be regulated. So in a competition, we included regulation that maintain or modify the fair level playing field, so fair competition, and that includes permits, fees, zoning strategies, limits to occupancy, or limits to caps on vehicles, etc. We look at the taxation, focus on taxation, and captures the regulation that looks at or creates local and national revenues, and establishment and collection of fees. So we can think of how the income is these activities, but as well whether there is a tourist tax established, etc. Then safety looks at the consumer and citizen safety. So for example, guest registration, safety measures, but as well inspection of vehicles or different driving tests, etc. Consumer protection looks at the regulation of privacy, accessibility, and non-discrimination. And public goods, within the public goods, we included regulation that refers to, for example, environment, congestion limits, gentrification, etc., etc. So within this five regulatory areas, we have in together 11 components. So that's why the regulator stringency index range from 0 to 11. It would be nicer 0 to 10, but unfortunately we end up with 11. So let's go from 0 to 11. We collect data so the data is on city year level, but we collect data on every 2 years, biannually. And we do it mostly because the regulation generally don't change every year. So even if the most kind of active regulators, which is Barcelona and Amsterdam, they do it every 2 years. So we kind of group the events every two years. So we have time spent from 2012 to 2022. As I said, the higher score means higher stringency, and we don't apply any measures. We basically add these components, and so what it does, it actually measures how demanding or how many items the regulation detail. And we think more detailed regulation, more stringent regulation, more demanding regulation for platforms. The index is computed for both sectors separately, but it's done so it can be compared. So we can actually compare countries, cities across time, but as well the sectors. And I think this is an important added value because most of the research that was done on platforms was generally focusing on Airbnb and housing, short-term rental, or on Uber and similar in transportation sector. We can actually compare more or less both. So we try to mirror the components and the indicators so it can be compared. So the index can actually grow and fall. So the stringency or the regulation can loosen up or can get more demanding from in time. So we can actually capture this with our index. So we can see whether there is fluctuation or not. We don't measure like number of regulation, whether cities regulate, I don't know, give more, create more laws, but we look at the content. We look within it. And yeah, so what we did empirically with this index, so we coded 108 European cities in 9 countries in this time period. We try to capture broad variation of cities and countries in Europe. So we look at the southern Europe, so Spain and Italy, western continental Europe. So we have Germany and France, the French cities. We have UK and Eastern European countries, Poland, Romania, and Hungary. And we have a Netherlands, we as a kind of Northern European country. Yeah, so and that's mostly because we rely on a group of coders. So we look at the local regulation and the national regulation. So group of research assistants were coding the regulations and using a common code book depending on their language abilities and the knowledge of the cases. So this is what we have, and then we have cross-coder validation and yeah, the resulting data set we have. So and as I said, we look at the 2 sectors, Airbnb, so short-term rental and ride hailing. So I would like to walk you with some of the results we have, and I have as well prepared some if we have time, new results that are not yet published. So, regulator stringency index, I think it's a very useful tool because it allows us to compare not only countries but as well cities and countries within the cities and in time. And so what we find out in our paper. So if we plug basically this is average regulatory stringency for all cities we have in sample. So it's pooled, but it's pooled cities and countries together, but sector specific. So we have Airbnb, what we call Airbnb or Uber for kind of shorter labels. And what we see, indeed, there is tightening of the regulatory grip at local level. Yeah, so the stringency score is growing, not too much, on average 2.7 for Uber and 1.7 for Airbnb. But we see that indeed the cities are regulating more harshly. So it's kind of answer the first question, the platform power of these companies, at least in these two sectors, are decreasing in time. As well, we don't see some kind of abrupt changes. It's more or less kind of the traditional incremental regulation in time. So there's definitely not one-off disruption going on, but cities are learning and improving their regulation. And we see as well a difference across sectors. So we can see that whereas regulation of Airbnb is kind of steadily increase, for Uber we see more fluctuation. So these are kind of two peaks around 2016 and 2022, I think. So the sector differences are important, but there are other variations that we uncover in our data with this index that are as well very, very interesting. So we look at the geographical variation. So this is our index mapped, put regulatory stringency index that put in the as a heat map. The darker colors mean higher stringency. And we see for, this is for Airbnb and 2022, for on the left side, you can see the cities we have in the sample, and on the right side, you can see countries. And you can already see that that is quite interesting geographical variation. So not all countries or not all cities, even within countries, are the same. But if we look at the time evolution, the geographical variation across time, we actually see much higher, like we see much greater variation between the countries and time trends. So we observed the general tightening that we saw on the previous figure. So cities are indeed, at least in short-term rental, are regulating more tightly, but there are variation in countries. So, for example, Dutch cities in Netherlands, they jumped from 1 to 8.6 score within 10 years. French cities increased from 5.4 to 7 in the same period. And some others, for example, Italian cities or German cities are increasing only slightly, or Poland, for example, we see that there is no regulation at all. For Uber, the situation is quite different, right? So we not only we see much less geographical variation at the national level, but we as well see a lot of very similar scores across cities, and geographically across Europe. And if we look at the patterns over time, these are actually much more diverse. So not only we see increase in regulatory stringency, but we actually observe decreasing level of regulatory stringency in some countries. Germany and in Netherlands. They decreased their stringency scores. So the regulation for Uber in these countries are actually opening up or decreasing in their demands. And particularly the Dutch case was very, very famous because there was the Dutch taxi wars and a lot of protest by taxi drivers, which actually led to decreasing regulation for Uber rather than increasing. And this is something that we actually found in our data, that protest events are actually not leading to high stringency, but or they are or no having effect or being counterproductive, which I think is some interesting story to explore. And generally, when we can actually observe with our index as well where the regulation loosens, and it's generally in the taximeter. So generally, this is the item or the focus sphere where the cities withdraw the regulation. So, however, in the most kind of drastic changes we can observe in both graphs are actually in Eastern Europe. So Eastern European cities and countries are actually the most drastical or most intense regulators in very short time. So they have the biggest jumps in regulation. And so that leads me to third finding that we have in the paper, and these are the different patterns of change. So not only we see the time trend and geographical variation, but we as well identify different patterns or different strategies that cities have via platforms. And one is this gradual tightening over time. We call it turtles. So this is kind of the constant tweaking, controlling, whether the regulation has effect, adapting. So it's kind of slow growing of stringency, which is generally seen in Germany, France, but as well in Spain. And then we have a sudden regulatory shifts following political pressure. So this kind of intense regulatory changes, and these are generally focused within Central Europe, and generally these are followed. So the general Eastern European countries and cities, they don't really regulate until they regulate very tightly. Yeah, so they have this kind of very intense shifts in the regulation, and of course the difference within the strategies. So this is what we basically find in our paper. We see that the platform power is not uniform, not universal, but very contingent on the context. The cities are actually finding the way how they tighten the regulations and gaining back the power and regulatory space over platforms that were until very recently deemed very powerful and basically omnipotent with a lot of money and resources, almost maybe bigger than a country's national countries. So we see the cities are actually standing their ground. We uncover very interesting difference in stringency across sectors. So it makes sense to differentiate between the policy sectors. We cannot say the platforms make a difference or platforms influence, but there's really like a context and sector specific finding. We find the different strategies of cities and these consistently cluster within countries. So we think that this is a sign of some kind of role of administrative structure or political economic models that playing a role in this choice of different regulatory strategies. And we as well see with our index we can actually look as well in on which areas the regulation stringency focus more. So we see different regulatory cultures of focus. So whereas in Southern European countries are focusing more on public goods and housing prices and congestion, others are Central Eastern European and Central Western Europeans are focusing more on market, so level playing field and economic focus. And if I have two more minutes, I would like to kind of talk about what we do next with this index, because I think it was useful not only for this paper, but for other aspects we are looking with our project. And very good way how to deal with the weaknesses of one paper is to suggest the future research, right? So I wanted to present what we do with the stringency index in the future research. So we want to look at the national administrative culture, a regulatory stringency, to see how cities operate within the multi-level governance system and whether different administrative structures and administrative cultures makes a difference on the way how platforms are regulated. We want to look at the different actors coalition that determines, so what determines the regulatory stringency, using regulatory stringency index as the dependent variable, and look at the different policy style and union on interest organizations. We want to look at local regulatory capacity to enforce. I think will be very important. One of the weak points of the index is that it looks at the regulation as is written in the law, in the text, but not whether it's really enforced. So some really tight, very demanding regulations might never be enforced in practice. So that might be that's a objective weakness of this indicator, but we would like to see whether the choice of the stringency, or like the level of stringency already kind of captures the capacities that city has to enforce, or whether they are used more kind of like trying to kind of say, be aware, if you behave badly, you will be punished. And we would like to as well look at the within country variation and diffusion. And we already looked at some of these points. So for example, here you can see the trajectories of the single cities. And what we find that some countries, this is for example the main cities, and how they vary even in Uber stringency and Airbnb. And you see that there's already there's quite big variation. So what we can see as well, we see big cities, but we see as well the smaller cities, and we wanted to see how they are consistent within countries. So whether we see kind of cities are very different, behaving very differently, regulating very differently, or whether there is some kind of clustering. And we see that, for example, for Airbnb, there's much more wider variation in regulatory stringency. So cities are experimenting more, and it's specifically in Spain, Germany, and Italy. So Southern European cities and German cities. Whereas for example, for Uber is much more national story. So the cities tends to follow national rules. So we don't see much within country variation. And this can be, you see the national level variation differences and the cities within. And you see that on the right side, the colors are similar to the national level. So we already see that there is some kind of local story, national story, and the multi-level organization within the policy fields make a difference. And we as well look at the determinants of local regulatory stringency, and we look at the different factors in one of the papers that hopefully soon will be submitted. So we use the regulatory stringency index as the dependent variable, and we see, for example, whether the ideology of the mayor, protests, or lobby, so local interest organization matters for local stringency, regulatory stringency. And we look as well on administrative style. So what we call administrative style is whether whether cities are cooperative administrative style would be whether the cities are creating regulation in cooperation or collaborating with other actors or platforms, but as well local interest organizations, citizens, etc., whether they do it unilaterally. And we actually find that the local administrative style is driving the results as well as a local interest organization. And we as well we find out that especially consensual cooperative style. So more open the regulatory processes to other actors, more harshly platforms are regulated. Yeah. So this is one of the findings that and uses of the regulatory stringency index in the future, and would we with it. And yes, it allows as well to look at the policy diffusions and the granularity, so the aspects that we coded actually allows us to are more used or more effective or not. So this is some of the findings and uses of the local regulatory stringency index in our paper, and I'm really looking forward to some comments, ideas, maybe suggestions for the futures, or questions you might have on the project and its focus. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eliška, for this very interesting presentation. And we would like to open the floor for comments and questions.
If no one goes, I will go first, if I may. Thank you again for the presentation. Very interesting study. I have a few questions, and maybe I will use 2 rounds of possibility to question. First of all, what is unique about, say, the regulatory problem in around Airbnb or around Uber and share driving and so on? To what extent they differ from road safety, water, recycling issues? So in a way, are we facing a new types of regulatory problems, or this is the same regulatory challenges in a different, say, technology or context and so on? And I'm speaking about local regulation, which I find very interesting because the local authorities are very, very important. So I'll start with that, and if time allow, we'll go for other questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so whether it's different or not. So what I think is, I think it's not so different in the sense that how we see how the cities approach to this problem, but that's actually unexpected finding for many. They thought this is a innovative, this is a very new, it's disruptive, it changed the way how cities has to react, because if they do what they did always, they just lose them, right? They lose the momentum, and then it's gone, and the platform had their upper hand on them, and they do whatever they want. They disregard the regulation, and there's no way back. It's kind of the platform power will increase. So, and what we observe is not actually this is not happening. It's quite so the transformation that technology and platforms bring to these sectors means that the cities have to learn new skills, and they do it relatively fast. So the changes are happening very quickly, but actually they keep up. I mean, they do that, and they do it with instruments that are very similar to things that they were doing previously. And in another paper, we actually see that the structures or the way how German cities, for example, cooperate in understanding how they should regulate Airbnb within 10 years, it looks very similar. And we actually have a problem with the paper because it's not very surprising for Germany. But the thing is that even if it's something so disrupting, new in technology, and it was really happening at the same time and very intense period, because if you look at the, for example, increase of the listings of Airbnb in Berlin or Hamburg within 10 years is massive. Yeah, still the regulatory instruments and the way kind of how the cities regulate do their things, it's quite similar. So I think it's very interesting. It's kind of not disruptive change, but it's more adaptive change on and using technology. So the
And
cities are
using
kind of
regulation
learning
for,
how
yeah.
to deal.
So just
Yeah.
so it means that the regulatory structure, regulatory philosophy is still there, is still valid. We don't have a lot of revolutions in the regulatory philosophy of the city vis-à-vis business. That this is a success story, actually. So, yeah, it's a success. And then I wonder if there are new department, new agencies for regulating the platforms, or goes to the same departments which are adapting. Is it more about change within the administration by creating new agencies, or old agencies are taking over?
So this we cannot really capture with the regulatory stringency index. In the project, we have a quite detailed code book. So our research assistants spend a lot of time coding on different aspects of this regulation. So for first question, whether this is a success story, what I described is the way how the city is dealing with that and how it kind of what we don't observe is that the platforms or the businesses are ruling over the cities, and the cities just give up and say, okay, free market for all. No, there is indeed regulation. But whether this is a success story, I think this is a sort of different indicators. Whether the regulation on Airbnb, for example, managed to return apartments to the long-term rental market, or whether the apartments are costing less. This is a different story. In other research using different kind of indicators showing that some kind of regulatory tools are more successful than others. And I think this, for example, could be done with our regulatory stringency index. So you could see at the different tools whether, for example, zoning makes difference, or whether, I don't know, caps and limits or price caps make effect. You can do it with this index. We didn't. And regarding the agencies, so what we know from the coding is that the structures that regulates generally are the same. We see they kind of adapt, even if so. For example, Uber, Airbnb in Germany is regulated through misappropriation laws. And in other places is regulated through the tourism sector. So the interesting part is where it kind of lands and in which sector it's regulated. But where I think where the structures has changed the most, it's in the enforcement of the regulation. And it's because the enforcement has to do with kind of a coordination, different aspects, not only like people that go and check whether that happened, but kind of proactive and more technologically advanced data collection and kind of identification of the cases of abuse or whatever. Yeah, so I think that it's where we see the biggest change in the enforcement, as well on how the burden of enforcing and informing is shifting from cities towards the platforms, which I think is as well interesting dynamics. So kind of some platforms has to co-police the users and enforce, or collect taxes together with cities, which I think is interesting new innovative way how to kind of create bridges or cooperation within private and public sector.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have more questions? If not, I will have a few. Yes, Ilya, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting. And while listening to the presentation, I was wondering whether there are some patterns on the level of those 5 dimensions which you highlighted at the very beginning. I mean, taxation, public goods, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering whether, if we look at the data from this perspective, from the perspective of these 5 distinct dimensions, whether there are some meaningful differences on this level. For instance, some cities might emphasize some dimensions at the expense of others, and that dynamics can be different on the level of these dimensions. So things like that. Have you looked at the data from this perspective, and are there any patterns? Thank you so much.
Yes, so the difference in dimensions, yes, indeed, they are. And as I said, we see kind of where the cities on so if you look at the stringency score, you see the 7 or 6 or 11 or 11's all everywhere. So we do have cities that regulate everywhere, but there is some kind of variation. So 2 cities that has 7 they are different, right? Some of them are focusing more on market, so they really like, for example, in case of Uber or ride hailing, they will be really into like number of vehicles and cabs and taximeter and tests and whatever. The other will be more, for example, other cities will focus on congestion or zones or kind of security or safety regulations. So there is difference. And this difference actually what's interesting for us, it's not a kind of random, but it really clusters on country level. So we see that, for example, Southern European countries are more kind of pro-public goods regulation, much more than other countries. And we as well see that the taxation is everywhere important. So the way how you tax, it's everywhere. But yeah, this focus on, for example, public goods versus market is actually very strong. And it's not just UK or something, but more like Germany, France. And I think this might be interesting when we want to explore how, for example, administrative culture plays into the choice of not only regulatory tools, but as well on regulatory focus areas. So whether some regulatory cultures or administrative cultures are more pro public goods or not, and whether this is still consistent, whether they regulate consistently with their administrative culture, even in sectors like when they are disrupted by platforms. That might be, for example, interesting. I'm exploring this, and I think yeah, maybe we have something relevant there, but we see some differences.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, if no more questions, so I will go with a few comments and questions as well. So first of all, thank you for this really nice contribution. I think it pushes forward the debates on stringency and a very nice application as well. My first question is about stringency and overall the concept of regulatory stringency. So if I understood correctly, the definitions you raise or you use is the intensity of local regulation. And what I'm wondering if this is actually what is being measured. So you had these 11 focuses or domains or topics. And if I understood correctly, you measure them in a binary way, so whether they exist or not. And I'm wondering whether if we have two cities with the same profile, the same stringency levels, and the same coverage of domains or topics? Are they actually equal, or is there any differences in the way they're actually putting those regulations? So just if we take, for example, tests for drivers, there are very different ways to test knowledge tests, sorry, for drivers, and that could be more restrictive, less restrictive, more permissive, and so on and so forth. And so my question is general about whether you actually measure stringency or it's more about what is actually being covered by regulation. And then the second question goes more to the question of what does it actually mean, or what can we actually how can we actually interpret this variation? And you went at the end to this nice figure about the lobby of hotels, and this is what I wanted also to ask: how can we actually disentangle the platform's power from what we see? We know there are different cultures or different ways according to which countries or organizations, more general, make regulations. Some are more permissive, some are more restrictive. Is it actually a manifestation of power of platforms, or it could be other more things? And then two last comments. So one of them is about the regulatory strategies, about the contrast between gradual and sudden. And I'm also wondering what is the role of legal culture in this regard. So we also know that some countries make very large rules, regulations with a lot of topics, which could be a way to observe sudden increase. And there are some countries who make very small or very short regulations that each tackles different topics. So I'm wondering whether those are strategies or just cultures, the way in which cities or countries make regulations. And last comment is more a suggestion, maybe to take a portfolios approach where you could actually have two dimensions. One of them is the topics being covered, and the other one is the cities. And then to have different snapshots over the time, and to see also what is being changed over time. So which topics are more getting more stringent or more covered over the years, which less. I was really wondering what do we actually see? Is there any increase in different areas or different topics, or decrease in some? And I'll stop here. But overall, thank you very much. Really enjoyed.
We lost. I'm lost. Oh,
I hope so.
but
Can you
I
hear
hope.
me? I think my internet is not.
yeah, we'll wait patiently for your internet.
Yeah, I hope I don't need to repeat everything.
Hear me?
No, we hope so.
I'm frozen. And now we are moving. I
Okay. Yeah.
hope. Can you hear me?
Yes.
The internet, I think. I think the internet plays. So I think that was the last question I didn't hear. So we can Neil, you can maybe
I'll share
tell
it.
me more about. But
Sure.
yeah, but so indeed, so we call it the stringency index because we wanted to capture the kind of to compare the cities how how they regulate, whether they regulate more. And we coded and we wanted to compare. So this for us was very important. So So you are right, we don't measure like intensity within each item. So for example, how demanding are the vehicle controls, or how demanding are the, I don't know, how, whether the cities regulate, whether the cities create the caps for 90 days or 180 days, but whether they just, whether the caps exist. So whether they said you can rent your Airbnb only for X amount of time. And for us, this was important because we had seven coders from different languages, cities, and it kind of, that was a parsimonious choice. So indeed, it's kind of a answer to question: do they have tests? Yes or no? So that was for us kind of easy, understandable. So if we look, being very precise, we look at kind of the details of regulation or the aspects that are covered in the regulation. So for us, is more stringent, is more kind of demanding in the sense of more aspects that the platforms has to obey when they enter to the market. So we don't have the intensity of the stringency within one sector. So it can be that you have two cities with exactly the same score, and they have as well same focus, but one is much more demanding in the sense of putting higher taxes, more demanding exams, and having, I don't know, higher, like bigger limits to number of taxis per number of Ubers per taxi. But I don't think that this is so meaningful difference. I mean, it's kind of question whether they are harsher or not. For me, it's interesting. They already think about the different aspects. So we want to regulate the way how they compete between each other. We want to regulate their public impact of these platforms, and we want to regulate how solid are they are. So how we tax them, and we want to regulate how safe they are for our citizens, rather than we want to, kind of whether you do it more harshly or not. This is kind of question whether we will be Sweden or Denmark or something like that. But like we are talking about Poland, comparing Poland and Hungary with Netherlands and UK. So they are very different countries with very different ways of doing that. And I think we find parsimonious way of doing it. How we can interpret and disentangle the permissive and restrictive, and who is doing that. So kind of a question, what determines the score, or what determines the choice of tools on the level, if I understand it correctly, right? So kind of using what's the mix created. So if we kind of leverage two things that I think are important. So it's very short period of time. So we are looking at 10 years. So it's very unlikely that the institutional and administrative kind of macro structure would change. So we don't have changes in political systems. We don't have changes in economic system. We don't have changes in electoral systems or anything like that that would change, for example, the way how, I don't know, administrative culture, etc., etc. The platforms are kind of erupting or entering to the local markets more or less at the same time within Europe, and they use a very similar strategy. So for us, it's kind of an almost semi-experimental way. So we actually now are looking what varies, what changes, or what makes the variation. And what we found when we collect the data, so we look at the interest organization, which is, I think, very important. So this is something that makes a difference for regulatory stringency, and it increase stringency. So in countries or cities where you have local interest representation, so taxi, hotel, or resident unions, the platforms are more stringently regulated. We look at as well at the ideology of political representatives, so ideology of mayor, from which party is coming from, and there we find a very interesting pattern. So it's not like a left-leaning mayors are regulating platforms more harshly, but it's rather than it's kind of a U shape. So more radical left or right, they they kind of regulate a similar way. So it's more kind of like a center versus the ideological extremes. And it's not somehow kind of very linear structure, but where we find actually very strong impact. So protests as well, they matter, but not the way how we imagine. So generally tend to be counterproductive. More protests, you have less regulation for platforms. But the local regulatory styles are interesting. So how cities decides to regulate. So whether they open up the regulatory process or whether they keep it kind of closed unilaterally, they decide how they will regulate. And I think, and this is what makes the biggest difference. And that's what kind of varies as well. It clusters within the countries, but it varies quite a lot as well. And the portfolio topics, I think this is a very very good suggestion because the portfolio actually builds up. So kind of the choice what you regulate first and then what you regulate later is actually very interesting. So like a sequence, time sequence, because the index, what we see, it's kind of building up, sometimes very abruptly and sometimes very gradually. So whether some cities choose to first regulate on the market and then they move to the kind of more normative focus like a public goods or safety and security, or whether they go firstly on safety and security. And we see there is a variation. So for example, UK, it's more about safety and security a lot first. Nordic countries, they have a lot of taxes first. So that's an important thing. Market is important, Germany, France, and in Southern Europe, you have, for example, the sequences, it's different. So not only like portfolio, but as well like a sequence in time is important. And the last question, I was frozen. My connection broke, so I couldn't hear that. But
we have to finish anyway, so we'll give it up. Neo, do you want to go on summarizing?
Yeah, please. So, Eliška, thank you very much again for this very interesting presentation, for sharing your research. Yeah, and wish everyone a pleasant afternoon, morning, evening, depends where you are. So, see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
And